Hi, I'm Barbara Lucas, and welcome to the Green Room, where we explore the environmental topics that green up our world. The global climate is warming, and extreme weather events are increasing. Is reversing this trend feasible? Today's guests say yes. We'll be talking about a proposal to put a price on carbon and distribute the revenue to the public as a dividend to stimulate the economy. Our guests are Ginny Rogers and Louis Merlin, members of the Ann Arbor chapter of the Citizens Climate Lobby. Ginny and Louis, welcome to the show.
Hi, Barbara.
Glad
Thanks.
to be here.
So Ginny, you are the founder of the Ann Arbor chapter. How many chapters are there?
Well, there's about 230 chapters in North America, and we're growing every month. We are adding new chapters every month. And there's about 8 in Michigan right now. We actually are starting a 9th one up right now.
Great. In Birmingham area?
Yeah, Detroit suburbs.
Great.
Yeah,
And it's federal legislation thereafter, right?
that's right. We are proposing to put a price on carbon in which the price starts out kind of low, and it goes up steadily every year in a predictable way, and then 100% of the revenue is returned as a monthly dividend to all households.
And would the dividend be equal to each member of?
Yeah, it's on a per capita share, so every adult would get the same amount every month, and I think it's set up as 1 share per adult and up to 2 in a household, and a half a share per each child up to 2 in a household.
And at what point in the process would it be collected?
It's collected at the source, so that means like at the well or mine or port of entry. That's, we call it upstream as far as possible, so that it applies to all in fossil fuel use. You don't have to, tax at the gasoline pump, for example.
I see.
And it's the most efficient way to place a fee because there's fewer entities that you would have to charge a fee.
It's kind of the most upstream at the oil well, at the coal mine, or at the border, where something comes in that hasn't been carbon fee hasn't been applied before.
So it sounds pretty simple compared to cap and trade. How does it compare?
Yeah, cap and trade can be a lot more complex for several reasons. One is when you put the cap in, you're kind of guessing at how much the cap should be, and so the fee, the cost of meeting that cap can be highly variable. The other problem with cap and trade is that there's a lot of room for kind of setting aside different caps for different groups and different industries. There's a lot of room for special interest play. It can become very complex legislation. Compared to that, the carbon fee and dividends are very simple. You just set a price and then let the market and people respond.
Another thing with the cap and trade is that to make sure that industries are meeting the cap, you really sort of need inspectors, which is another level of complexity and bureaucracy that's needed. With a fee and dividend, really, you just pay the fee, the companies pass on the fee to consumers, and the dividend protects the consumers from the increased energy costs. So it's just a much simpler system.
And it's more predictable because you know each year what the price is going to be. And how does that affect, like, for instance, innovation?
Yeah, so because the price is spelled out, the price every year is spelled out, it's much easier for businesses to plan. When does an investment make sense? It's also easier for innovators who are in, say, new energy economy to say, well, will my product sell if I know that there's going to be this carbon fee? My solar product or my wind product is going to be that much more competitive. So it really helps innovators of all kinds move forward, knowing what that cost is, knowing what that carbon cost is.
You had an example yesterday of an innovator. What was that?
Yeah, so I'm in a research group at the University of Michigan, and not myself, but one of my colleagues is working on biofuels, and he's coming up with very innovative ways to create biofuels very quickly. He actually stopped working on biofuels because the price of gas has become so low recently. It dropped something like $1 from the $3 range into the 230s, and he started researching applications in cosmetics instead. And I'm sure we want better cosmetics, but it would be great if we were paying the full price in terms of all the environmental impacts that gasoline and other fossil fuels are having. These biofuels would be much more competitive and might be already being developed.
So what you're referring to sounds like the externalities, which I was reading an article, an editorial by George Shultz, who I guess was the Secretary of State under Ronald Reagan, And his editorial is, let me just quote him, he says, "Let's level the playing field for competing sources of energy so that costs imposed on the community are borne by the sources of energy that created them." So,
Right, we're not paying the true costs of our use of fossil fuels because, as we know, fossil fuels are contributing to climate change by putting CO2 in the atmosphere, and it's already, the effects of it are already happening with increased storms, so we're having to deal with a lot more flooding, there's a lot more drought around the world, and those are just costs that as a society we're paying for already, but the fossil fuel companies don't have to pay that, it's a society that's paying that.
I mean, yeah, we're already paying those costs. I mean, even though no one climate incident storm can be attributed to climate change, if you think about the cost of Hurricane Katrina, if you think about the cost of Superstorm Sandy, we all pay for that. Well, the federal government pays for that. We're paying for that with our taxes. The argument here is because the increase in those storms, the number and severity of the storms is caused by climate change, it really ought to be the people who are putting carbon dioxide in the atmosphere who are paying those costs. And that would be fair. That would be, it's not fair when you create problems and you force it on someone else and you don't pay for it. So that's what capturing externalities means. It means everyone's paying for the cost that they're creating.
And you're an urban planner, and you mentioned
Yes.
that a lot of the municipalities that you consult with are spending a lot of money on climate adaptation.
That's right.
What's that?
So even though there's debate about whether climate change exists or not in the political sphere, in the sphere of where people actually plan for the future of cities and infrastructure, people aren't debating it. There's too much evidence already in terms of rising water levels, in terms of increased flooding, in terms of increased droughts. So when people are planning for infrastructure, even the Department of Defense is planning for it. When people plan for long-term infrastructure, they have to take these long-term effects into account. It would be
That's
irresponsible not to.
expensive.
Yeah.
So it's costs that we're having to deal with.
You know, build your roads higher, be able to withstand stronger storms. All of these infrastructure issues are things we're already having to plan for.
Mm-hmm. And pay for.
And pay for.
So why is a market-based approach, which this is, more amenable across the aisle?
Well, one reason why is because it doesn't involve regulations. Like we know right now, the Republicans in the Senate are really fighting the EPA regulations that have been proposed around coal power plants. And if we were able to, put a price on carbon, there really wouldn't be need for EPA regulations. This would take care of the problem.
I mean, setting the price on carbon is all about letting the market work and letting innovation happen. If you look at what's happened over the past 10 years, renewable energies have become much cheaper and could very likely compete with fossil fuels if they were paying their fair share, their full cost already. So this is just about making sure that everyone's on the same playing field, paying for the same externalities, and then the alternative energy sources, I think, could be much more competitive.
And maybe we don't need any subsidies at all then.
Yeah, there wouldn't be a need for subsidies. It's not, we don't advocate a particular source of energy, alternative energy. We don't have a position. I think that the market can decide what's the most efficient way. When everybody's paying their true cost, it's the market that can decide.
The things you don't have to do is you don't have to go plant by plant and say, is this plant clean enough? Is this plant clean enough? You don't have to go industry by industry saying, oh, we want natural gas to be the winner this year. We want wind to be the, every energy source has issues and complications. None of them are perfect. But if we set the price, then we can just let competition and the market solve the problem for us, essentially.
This book I'd like to mention, it's by Andrew Hoffman, How Culture Shapes the Climate Change Debate. I just finished it, and it's pretty interesting because he says that a large segment of Americans are worried about accepting the whole climate change concept because it feels anti-business. But I read a quote that the National Federation of Independent Businesses found that 30% of small businesses fail to reopen after disasters. So it seems like we need to get the word out that it could be a boon to business too.
I think this is really kind of a myth that addressing climate change is bad for business. I think there's a lot of evidence on the contrary. If we don't address climate change, it's going to be bad for business. There's a new website that's been put out by Henry Paulson, who was the Secretary of Treasury under George W. Bush, among others, about all of the economic impacts of not addressing climate change. So not just the major storms, but the major droughts, increased heats, agricultural failures can take place. So we're already experiencing a lot of these economic impacts. I think it's kind of a myth that if we don't do something, we're better off economically than if we do something about climate change.
And there might be some added benefits, like for instance with agriculture, if it becomes less fossil fuel based, there might be some benefits, maybe less pesticides, maybe better.
Right. There was, I heard recently a statistic about agriculture that in 1940, it took 1 calorie of fossil fuel to produce 2.3 calories of food. And nowadays our farming practices have changed so much that it takes 10 calories of fossil fuel to produce 1 calorie of food. And that's a lot due to all of the pesticides and fertilizers that are used that are produced from fossil fuels that are needed because of the change in farming practices. For example, we don't rotate crops, and that depletes the soil. And soil actually in and of itself can be a carbon sink. So not only does it make the farming less efficient, but it makes it less accepting of carbon.
And one of the ways, as farming becomes more difficult, one of the ways farmers can stay on their land often is by having green energy, clean energy generation as a co-product of their land. So having wind, you see a lot of this in Michigan, wind farms on farms, or solar panels as part of farms.
And I suppose the utility companies as well can start doing various types of renewable energy so that they're not just going under because they're fossil fuel businesses.
Well, I mean, one of the presenters, so every month we have a presenter with a different perspective, and one of the presenters 1 or 2 months ago was Shell Oil, and they were saying they're actually for a carbon fee and dividend. Not because it won't have any impact on their business, but it will create a level of certainty. Right now there's so much uncertainty about what's going to happen about climate policy when having a clear policy, a consistent policy, especially if it was more consistent internationally, I think would really help industries adapt to this future.
Mm-hmm. What would be the impact on the poor?
Well, we recently had a study of our proposal that showed that if you return all of the money that's collected paid by fossil fuel companies, if you return it all to individuals, they have that money back in their pocket to spend. They can continue buying things, and it puts that money back into the economy. So this proposal would actually create jobs. The study showed that within 10 years it would create 2.1 million jobs over doing nothing. And it would put, additional money into people's pockets. So it would actually help the economy.
Yeah, so for most households, for 2/3 of households, they'll actually be getting more in than they'll be paying because of more expensive energy fees. And most of those households will be the lower income and poor households because they just don't spend as much. They don't spend as much on everything, but also don't spend as much on energy. They don't have boats and
they
multiple
have
vehicles.
A higher percentage of their income might go towards energy costs, but as a dollar amount, they tend to have smaller houses, travel less by plane, buy less goods that require fossil fuels to produce them. So they would get more back in their dividend than they would be spending due to increased energy costs on average.
And just to be clear, the dividend it's based on per capita. It's based on the number of people. So if I have a 2-person household that's poor and a 2-person household that's rich, they get the same check back.
Okay.
So proportionally, that's going to be a lot larger for the poor household.
So 2/3 of the population will come out ahead, and then the third that maybe has to do some changes in their lifestyle. Well, hopefully everyone will do changes in their lifestyle, because it seems to me that we're very driven by price. Even if you're wealthy, you're not going to spend twice as much for a mug as a different mug. You know, you just, so that will be helpful, but also people will know ahead of time, like for instance, if I put in insulation in my roof, it's going to pay off for sure, because
Right, it's going to make more sense for you to do what you can to be more efficient, energy efficient, so that the money that you're getting back is not going towards your energy costs.
All right, what about in other countries? What's going on elsewhere?
Well, there's already a lot of countries that have put in some kind of price on carbon. I think it's around 40 countries and around 20%, a little more than 20% of the carbon emissions worldwide. So we're not the leaders on this. We're not sticking out our necks on this. We're actually kind of the followers on this. This is something that might help us get out front again, be kind of the leaders and the innovators again. One of the big concerns, of course, is China, and one of the big momentum items for momentum in the past year was that President Obama did come to an agreement with the Chinese about having a limit on carbon emissions and a trajectory headed downwards, I think, starting something like 2020. So there's a huge appetite for U.S. leadership on this issue. I think a lot of other countries are ahead of us on this.
Yeah, I think actually of the top 10 economies in the world, only 2 don't have some plan or some current pricing for carbon, and that's the United States and Russia.
And just to kind of put a point on it, British Columbia, which is one of the provinces of Canada, has had a carbon price in place, a carbon price with a dividend, with kind of a dividend refund in place since the 1990s, and since that time they've had
since 2008 actually.
2008
is when they instituted their
Okay,
carbon. Yeah.
thank you. They've had faster economic growth, faster job growth than the rest of Canada.
And it significantly decreased their greenhouse gas emissions.
Great. Another thing that was interesting about this book is he said that a lot of people don't want to accept it because it seems too negative. The idea that, you know, we're going to have to sacrifice, and you know, some of the things we've been talking about would be added benefits, like, you know, if we decrease the air pollution, we'll maybe have less asthma and, you know, heart disease. And I was actually thinking about how when we moved to Ann Arbor 5 years ago, we gave up one of our cars because we were living so close that we could ride our bikes or walk or take the bus to town. And I actually feel like it was a improvement in my quality of life. I get more exercise, I meet my neighbors, I really enjoy, you know, the change instead of fighting traffic and looking for parking. But what about people that don't want to live in urban areas? You know, will this help them too?
Well, I think they can have a choice for how they want to live. They could, you know, they can still continue to live where they want, and maybe they'll, you know, put up solar panels and become more independent, you know, energy independent, and then they can use their money to you know, continue to live far out and drive back and forth.
I think, you know, I think one thing that we all believe is that as Americans we should continue to have choices, and that there are going to be a lot of different ways to be energy efficient. You can be energy efficient in a rural area, you can be energy efficient in an urban area, and there's also people who are going to choose not to be energy efficient and just choose to pay more, and that's going to be an acceptable option as well. But as you said, most people are going to be motivated to find energy savings in order to have a little money in their pocket.
It seems like libertarians would like this too.
Yeah.
I mean, the off-the-grid thing is certainly
Right.
Libertarian value. So how can people get more information about all this?
A great way to find out information about our organization is through the Citizens Climate Lobby website, which is just citizensclimatelobby.org.
Okay, great. And you were telling me yesterday about climate.nasa.gov.
Right, so NASA has a really excellent website that gives you very even-handed information about how the climate is changing, what is the evidence of climate change, what are some of the implications of climate change, and of course, being a NASA website, that, you know, wonderful visuals and photos of ice caps and landscapes and so forth. I think I remember seeing one visual of many acres of solar panels in California. So it's a very informative, I think, even-handed website about what's going on with climate right now.
And there's one about economic impacts, right?
Right. The risky business,
.org.
Riskybusiness.org
Okay.
is about how if we don't take action to reduce climate change, we will have economic impacts. Climate change will have economic impacts. And if you look at insurance companies, they're already trying to plan for these impacts. They're not really debating them.
Most businesses are already planning for it.
Yeah.
Moving forward. All right, well, great. This has been really interesting. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Barbara.
welcome.
Appreciate it.
For an online archive of today's show, go to ewashta.org/greenroom. Thanks for joining us here in the Green Room.